GDP growth year-on-year for nearly 40 years. However, looking at this IMF chart, GDP growth over the last 15 years, and looking at the forecast for the next few years, one can see the problem. Since 2007, when China achieved an astronomical 14% GDP growth in 1 year, the trend is clear: a decline, and a rather drastic one. It's about to drop to 3% GDP growth in a year or two. And as we shall see later, these figures too may be overly optimistic. Of course, someone will say, you can't keep growing at 10% year-on-year forever. Yes, but in per capita terms, China still remains an essentially poor country. Even in purchasing power parity terms, which are more favorable for China, both the IMF and the World Bank place China about the 80th place of the richest world nations. And let's keep in mind the huge inequality in the Middle Kingdom. The Gini index, which monitors this relationship, has doubled in China over the past 40 years. This means that the rich East Coast is driving up the wealth statistics of the Chinese people. The agricultural and rural interior of the country is still very, very poor. To sum up, an economic slowdown in China was to be expected, but only when China could be considered relatively wealthy in per capita terms. But the Chinese are still far from reaching that level, so that forecasts of 3% growth pose an existential problem for the Chinese Communist Party, which derives its legitimacy, so to speak, from statistics. There are many signs that China's socio-economic model of the past 40 years is running out of steam. Meanwhile, the party has no idea for a new one. The cure for China's economy is simple, but it means losing control of society. So Beijing closes its eyes to it. As a result, for the time being, the response of the party's top leadership, led by Xi Jinping, is closer to the fashion presented some time ago by the Soviet Union. Welcome to the 20s Report. Consider leaving a like if you enjoyed the video to aid the algorithm. The year is 2010, and the world is on the brink of monumental change, as the once dominant United States faces a decline in its influence. Other formidable powers are poised to reshape the global landscape. China rises with fierce ambition, eager to assert its dominance. Russia plays a complex game of strategy, challenging the resolve of Washington. Meanwhile, the European Union is determined to establish its significance on the world stage. In World Order, a partner of today's episode, players become one of these four superpowers, embarking on a thrilling quest for global supremacy. It is a 2 to 4 player strategy game that masterfully blends area control and deck building mechanics, offering asymmetrical strengths unique to each superpower. Players can strategically navigate the complexities of international relations and power dynamics, utilizing their superpowers' distinctive abilities to secure their place at the top. Will you rise to power and dictate the future of the world? The fate of global dominance is in your hands. Back World Order on Kickstarter now. Consumption, investment, production. These are the three key words for the Chinese economy in the middle of the third decade of the 21st century. Ever since Deng Xiaoping took the helm in the Middle Kingdom, he imposed a fundamental goal on the country's economy: investment in industry. Especially since the reforms of the 1970s, China has begun to devote an incredibly large proportion of its domestic product to investment. Over the past 20 years, it has been almost equal or above 40% of GDP. As Zhong Yuan Zhou Liu, to whom we will frequently refer in this material, writes in his excellent article for Foreign Affairs entitled China's Real Economics Crisis, this industrialist policy was outlined by China's great reformer. Quote, China's sixth five-year plan of 1981-85 was the first to be instituted after Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping opened up the Chinese economy. Although the document ran to more than 100 pages, nearly all of it was devoted to developing China's industrial sector, expanding international trade and advancing technology. Only a single page was given to the topic of increasing income and consumption. In other words, for 40 years, the Chinese have spent almost 40% of their income on new industrial investments, such as factories, infrastructure, apartment blocks, highways or railways, and technology, subsidizing research and development and providing financing for companies. A massive influx of foreign investment reinforced this process. Low wages attracted global, especially Western companies. The growing skills and industriousness of the workforce and the improving state of China's infrastructure, which is now a global benchmark. And this is where the problems begin. As Nobel laureate Paul Krugman points out, while this level of investment was justified for 30 years, when China had a rapidly growing labor force moving from rural areas and high productivity gains. But now this model is starting to become unsustainable. Or to put it in another way, this level of investment as a percentage of GDP is achievable, but investment is no longer effective. When we invest in something, we want that investment to pay for itself and to be efficient. When we buy a car, it improves our travel comfort and commuting time. A company that builds a factory expands its business or improves production. A country building a motorway, for example, improves connectivity and internal productivity. China continues to invest a lot, but often these investments do not make sense. The problem is that it is difficult to invest so much money without seeing serious diminishing returns. In short, this is not a country that can productively invest 40% of GDP. The crowning example is known to anyone who follows the global media. That's obviously the real estate bubble, which was exposed in 2021 with the collapse of the world's largest property developer, Evergrande. What level of inefficiency are we talking about? He Keng, 81-year-old former deputy head of the National Bureau of Statistics, puts it this way. Every expert gives a completely different figure, with the most extreme believing that the current number of empty houses is enough for 3 billion people. But he adds that this is probably an upward estimate, yet conceding that there are certainly enough empty houses to accommodate China's entire population of 1.4 billion. Other estimates put the number of surplus homes at 600 million. In other words, we are talking about a staggering amount of waste, since many, perhaps most, of these dwellings will never be occupied. First, China's population is already shrinking, and will continue to do so at an accelerating rate. Estimates for the year 2100 range from 800 million to as low as 400 million. Second, these blocks have often been built in random locations, with no connection to market demand. The thesis from the title disappeared from view for a while, but we are beginning to see it, right? Let's add that this highly inefficient property sector may account for up to 30% of China's GDP. However, the real estate sector is not the only bad apple in the basket. China's Communist Party is pushing for investment, economic growth, and increased production, not just in housing. The same is true for industry, with China producing far more than it can consume. As Zhou Liu writes, as a result, the Chinese economy risks falling into a cycle of falling prices, bankruptcies, factory closures, and ultimately, job losses. In other words, Chinese manufacturers are caught in a downright spiral of squeezing margins and fighting each other on price to death. However, the companies that survive are not necessarily those that are the most efficient or profitable. More often, it is those with the best access to state subsidies and cheap financing. So what is it? Why is China doing this to itself? To get the full picture, we need to add a second factor to Chinese policy: the maximum restriction of consumption. For decades, Beijing has set ambitious targets for investment and growth while ignoring the issue of its citizens' consumption. It is not an oversight, but a deliberate objective of the Chinese Communist Party. There are several reasons for this, but the most important is one: the control of the population. Let's take the example of one particular mechanism. In the free market countries, the aim of those in power is to create favorable conditions for their citizens to feel confident enough to spend their money. When they do feel safe, they spend their money, drive the economy, new jobs are created, while at the same time the government collects more money in taxes, which can be reinvested in infrastructure, public facilities or healthcare. These facilities in turn improve the optimism of consumers, who are not worried about running out of money to survive in the event of bad weather, and so spend their money again, driving economic growth. Meanwhile, in China, the whole system is designed to dampen the optimism of Chinese consumers. Why? There are many reasons why the average Chinese watches every yuan spent so carefully, but many of them revolve around the generally very poor quality of public services. The Chinese state does not provide many of the services that Western citizens can count on, forcing the Chinese to save massively. This includes healthcare, the often high cost of which is borne by citizens. The education system also forces parents to spend heavily on education, including private tuition. The elephant in the room is also the pension system, which does not provide adequate benefits in old age, especially in rural areas. Then there is the aforementioned property bubble, in which millions of Chinese have invested their savings, and the unstable labor market, which particularly affects the young. In short, the average Chinese is forced to save heavily for a rainy day. He puts his savings in a bank that is controlled by the state, in other words, the party. Companies seeing low domestic consumption are forced to sell their products mainly abroad. The creditors of these companies are state actors, so the private sector also ends up in the pockets of the Chinese Communist Party. This leads to a general conclusion. In the West, whoever owns capital has the power. In China, it is the other way round. Those with power own the capital. And the ultimate power, the mandate from heaven, is held by the party, with Xi at the top. The party concludes that it cannot pursue a policy in which consumers are happy to spend their money, because it would lose control over the flow of capital. So today the mechanism is as follows. The party has a monopoly of power. Power gives it the ability to construct appropriate domestic policies. Emphasizing investment and ignoring consumption leads to the accumulation of capital in state-owned banks. On the one hand, through the debt of the private sector, and on the other, through the high savings of the citizens. The money in the hands of the party gives it the ability to control the elites, both locally, in the state administrative structures, and in the economy, by controlling to whom the money is distributed. The elites in the hands of the party, in turn, keep society under their control. The hierarchical nature of the whole system is clear. And let's not forget the ideology. Consumption is seen as an individualistic distraction that takes people away from the party's collective goal of improving the industrial base. Individual prosperity can even provoke criminal thoughts, such as individual rights, civil liberties, or the right to privacy. And this is the crux of the problem. Beijing was able to maintain such a policy for 40 years, because the startup base was very low. The country was backward. The international investors were eager to locate their businesses in China. Today, however, the situation is different. Not only is Chinese overproduction beginning to irritate other countries, but the imposition of shackles on Chinese exports has recently become one of the overarching economic policies of the world's other two economic poles, the European Union and the United States. Today, these two centers are fiercely fighting Chinese exports with trade tariffs. They consider Chinese actions to be unfair trade practices. The Chinese are trying to circumvent these blockades by third countries, while also increasing their exports to the global south. But the trend towards containment of Beijing trade expansionism is clearly visible. Countries are now coming to the conclusion that Beijing is trying to drive local producers out of the market by subsidizing, for example, the electric car sector or green technology in general. The Chinese are doing this by exporting their products at minimal margins, or even below the cost of production, because that is what China's centrally controlled economic policy leads to. The world, albeit mainly the Western world, for the time being, is slowly beginning to build a wall. Overproduction combined with low consumption and the gradual rise of global protectionism is leading to a price squeeze in the Chinese market. This is leading to near zero inflation or even deflation, which is a deadly phenomenon. Deflation is an economic phenomenon in which prices in an economy fall instead of rising. It sounds great, but only in theory. Falling prices further discourage consumers from spending, because they wait for products to be even cheaper, which further cools the economy, leading to business failures, higher unemployment, and so on. This negative feedback loop is amplified by another mechanism of Chinese central management: local debt. It is important to remember that when China's top leadership sets out its strategy for the country, it incentivizes local governments to invest in the party's priority sectors and to meet certain targets. As a result, there is enormous pressure on local leaders to A. drive local GDP growth, and B. carry out the directives of the party leadership, regardless of whether the moves are realistically profitable or not. Interestingly, however, Beijing often does not provide central funding. Instead, it gives local officials a great deal of freedom to organize off-balance sheet investment vehicles with the help of regional banks to finance projects in priority sectors. Up to 30% of China's infrastructure has been built with the help of funding from these off-book financial constructs. The result? The Wall Street Journal reports that this unofficial local government debt is as high as $11 trillion, twice the size of the central government's debt. As much as $800 billion of this debt is at high risk of default. Moody's Investor Service and Fitch Ratings have downgraded China's credit rating outlook from stable to negative, mainly because of doubts about the ability of local governments to adequately service their debt. Regional debt, we should remember, is a part of the control mechanism in which Beijing is immersed. Just as the private sector remains hostage to the party, so too do local elites. The regions are forced to meet the party's ambitious targets, but at the same time they have to finance themselves. In the end, the local budget lacks funds for public services. Not without reason, as we have already mentioned. As a result, the central government's debt is a relatively low 45%. But if we add the local debt, we get a level of over 300% of GDP. The leaders in terms of total public debt are Japan and Luxembourg, with over 400%. At over 300%, countries such as France, Belgium, Canada and Sweden are eating into this level. In other words, countries that are much more developed than China. The Middle Kingdom is the most indebted country of the underdeveloped economies. Alright, but someone will say that China has its problems, but it remains a center of innovation and new technology. The problem is that, yes, Beijing is loudly supporting key sectors, with, for example, Made in China 2025 agenda. But at the same time, the whole system is somehow torpedoing innovation. It is true that China provides funding for the development of key technologies through its policies. But the mania for meeting targets encourages companies to invest and develop in mature technologies that will deliver results here and now. One example is robotics. China has overtaken Japan as the biggest power in the industrial robotics sector. By 2017, there were more than 800 robotics companies and 40 technology parks spread across 20 Chinese provinces. The problem was that local decision makers were funding projects that offered the quickest returns in the here and now, projects that could be scaled up quickly. As a result, as Zhou writes, currently China has a large overcapacity in low-end robotics, but still lacks sufficient capacity in high-end autonomous robotics, which requires indigenous intellectual property. The situation is somewhat similar in the artificial intelligence industry. AI research is widely funded, but the quality of AI research, especially in the field of generative AI, is hampered by government censorship and lack of indigenous intellectual property. Many Chinese AI startups rely on products and models developed in the West to prove results in the here and now, to show banks and other financial entities the rationale for their existence. As a result, in China, instead of revolution, there is a phenomenon of involution. This means that Chinese companies, fighting in a bloodthirsty internal market, instead of differentiating their products and creating new ones, try to beat their rivals by overproducing them from the market. Here again we return to the issue of oversupply and exports. As a result, Chinese companies, despite their hype, have no incentive to be innovative, but they have big incentives to scale up and produce. A lot. The end result is the following vicious cycle, as Zhou Liu notes. Quote, firms backed by bank loans and local government support must produce non-stop to maintain their cash flow. A production halt means no cash flow, prompting creditors to demand their money back. But as firms produce more, excess inventory grows and consumer prices drop further, causing firms to lose more money and require even more financial support from local governments and banks. And as companies go more deeply into debt, it becomes harder for them to pay it off, compounding the chance that they become zombie companies, essentially insolvent, but able to generate just enough cash flow to meet their creditors' obligations. As China's economy has stalled, the government has reduced the taxes and fees levied on firms as a way to spur growth. But that has reduced local government revenue, even as social services expenditures and debt payments rise. Matthew C. Klein and Michael Pettis, in their book Trade Wars Are Class Wars, describe the Chinese dilemma as follows. The PRC authorities face a huge risk of GDP collapse and soaring unemployment, which can be avoided by reducing the economy's reliance on investment spending and increasing domestic consumption. This means radically changing the distribution of wealth and income, so that Chinese households can afford what they produce. What has been taken away from Chinese workers and pensioners must be given back. The whole negative feedback mechanism has one source: central control mania. Beijing is trying to have its cake, to control the elites and society, and eat it too, to maintain economic growth and its own legitimacy. Now it is simply getting harder and harder to do this, and more skeletons are in the closet, weighing on the increasingly stunted GDP growth. In 2004, just as the Chinese economy was becoming a global force, a group of researchers began conducting nationwide surveys, asking Chinese people whether they were better off financially than they have been 5 years earlier. The percentage of people who said they were better off peaked in 2014, when 77% of respondents said they were. Last year, where respondents were asked the same question, this figure fell to 39%. And what do autocrats when domestic sentiment deteriorates? They tighten the screws even more. More and more criminal cases are opened, including against Apple's main partner, the Taiwanese company.
Scepter. Forthwith.
Dota tower is under attack.
Spherical sorcery. Double kill.
Structures are fortified. Triple tower is under attack.
Plagued me long enough.
Dire's courier has been slain.
Fresh mate.
Dota tower is under attack. is under attack.
As I live, I proceed. 'Tis tedious.
Radiant's courier has been slain.
So it is said. I forge exalt. I am a beacon of knowledge, blazing out across a world. Light my path. Away! Deep with fresh blade. Yes.
Your middle tower is under attack.
Exalt.
Your middle tower is under attack.
Such abnegation. Ignites
Your middle
lethargy.
tower is under attack.
Concentration. Over yon. This I'm well aware.
Your middle tower has fallen.
Speed exalt Triolis. Committed, one of my favorites. Unto battle. Words of power. I'll keep it in mind. Fine.
Your top tower is under attack.
This bores me. Over Scully's most cunning fabrications. An honor to fight me. From the great mystery. Thus and so. Orbs light my path. I love only to me.
Dominant performance.
Knowledge is power.
Your bottom tower is under attack. Radiant structures are fortified.
As from the arcade.
Double kill.
Well away. Witness
Your
true
top
sorcery.
tower is under attack.
Fresh
Killing spree.
with speed.
Your bottom tower is under attack.
I am commanding yes. On
Your middle tower is under attack. Your middle tower has fallen.
Unstoppable.
Your middle barracks are under attack.
Wicked sick. 2 innocent lives. Dominant performance.
Middle barracks are under
fallen. Your middle barracks are under attack. Your middle barracks have fallen. Your middle barracks have fallen. Your top tower is under attack. Your top tower has fallen. Your top barracks are under attack.